The metal doors of the railway car scraped against their tracks, shrieking into the thick heat of that Illinois summer day in 1944. Inside, men blinked against the sudden flood of daylight, their eyes adjusting slowly to the brightness after days spent in darkness. These were Wehrmacht soldiers, captured somewhere on the beaches of Normandy during those brutal weeks following the invasion, and they moved now with the peculiar stiffness of men who had spent too long confined in moving boxes, their muscles cramped, their uniforms stained with sweat and the accumulated grime of a journey across an ocean and then across half a continent. They shuffled down the ramp in an uneven line, boots scuffing against wood, and as they stepped onto American soil for the first time as prisoners rather than invaders, something in their bearing suggested they had not entirely accepted their new status. There remained in their posture, in the set of their shoulders and the tilt of their chins, a kind of stubborn defiance, a refusal to acknowledge that the war had moved beyond them, that the grand vision they had served was crumbling back home while they stood here in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by endless fields and a sky so blue it seemed almost offensive in its indifference to suffering. The landscape they passed through as the guards marched them toward the camp looked nothing like the Europe they knew. Everything here seemed to sprawl outward without restraint, farms stretching to horizons that refused to end, barns standing like small fortresses, roads cutting straight lines through territory that appeared to have never known the chaos of armies moving back and forth across it. One of the officers, a man who had once commanded a company near Caen, noticed the wooden crates stacked along a loading platform as they walked past. The boxes were filled to overflowing with apples, brilliant red and green spheres piled so carelessly that some had tumbled onto the ground where they lay unattended. He stopped for a moment, causing the man behind him to stumble, and he gestured toward the fruit with a dismissive wave of his hand. His voice carried clearly in the still air when he spoke, words in German that dripped with contempt, something about the size and the wateriness, about how such bloated specimens were fit only for livestock. The men near him laughed, a harsh sound that mixed bitterness with a kind of desperate bravado, as though mocking this small thing might restore some fragment of the superiority they had been taught to believe in since childhood. None of them understood yet that this fruit they were ridiculing would become the most persistent memory of their captivity, more vivid than the fences or the guards, or even the news of defeats that would trickle in through the months ahead. For these soldiers, apples carried weight beyond mere sustenance. Back in their homeland, in the regions where many of them had grown up, the apple represented something deeply embedded in the rhythm of life. In the valleys of Bavaria, along the terraced slopes of the Moselle, in the small family plots scattered through Württemberg and Hesse, apple trees marked the turning of seasons. Autumn meant festivals where the harvest was celebrated, where women baked strudels that filled houses with the smell of cinnamon and rendered butter, where the fruit was carefully stored in root cellars to last through winters when other food grew scarce. These orchards were small, managed by families who knew every tree, who pruned and tended and harvested by hand, passing down knowledge through generations. The soldiers carried with them an unshakable conviction that no orchard anywhere in the world could match what grew in German soil, that the particular balance of sweetness and tartness they remembered from home represented a kind of perfection that industrial America, with all its machines and vulgarity, could never achieve. This pride had survived the ocean crossing, had persisted through the shock of capture and the humiliation of surrender. It was as though the idea itself, the notion of German superiority in matters of culture and quality, might somehow shield them from the full weight of what had happened. The United States, they imagined, was a nation of excess and crudeness, all quantity without quality, machines churning out goods without soul or craft. What they did not know, could not have known from the propaganda that had shaped their understanding, was that this country produced apples on a scale that defied their comprehension. The numbers alone would have seemed like lies if someone had told them. More than 40 million bushels in a single year, orchards that covered entire valleys, processing facilities that ran day and night, supply chains that could feed not just the American population, but soldiers fighting across 2 oceans, and eventually, through some strange twist of fate, the very men who had tried to kill them. The irony of their situation was almost theatrical in its precision. Here they stood, remnants of an empire that had promised to last 1,000 years, reduced now to mocking fruit while completely blind to what that mockery would cost them. They could not see yet how their laughter would die, how the dismissive words would turn to ash in their mouths when confronted with evidence too overwhelming to deny. They did not understand that what they called tasteless would soon fill their stomachs until the ache became unbearable, that what they labelled as food for animals would become seared into their memories with a clarity that would persist for decades, long after the war ended and they returned to cities that no longer resembled the places they had left. The summer heat pressed down on them as they marched, guards flanking the column, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked and the sound of a tractor engine carried across the fields, ordinary sounds from an ordinary day in the American heartland, a day that meant nothing to the people who lived here, but everything to the men who walked in formation toward an uncertain future. When darkness finally came, and they were locked into the barracks at Camp Ellis, the whispered conversations began almost immediately. Men lay on narrow bunks, staring at ceilings, and talked in low voices about home. It was always home that drew them, the memories that felt more real than the present, more solid than the walls around them. And woven through those memories, appearing again and again with surprising frequency, was the subject of apples. To these men, raised in specific regions with specific traditions, the apple was far more than simple nourishment. It had become in their minds a kind of emblem, a marker of identity, a way to remember who they were before the war had taken them so far from anything familiar. The Bavarians spoke of orchards clinging to hillsides, trees that had been planted by grandfathers and great-grandfathers, varieties with names that meant nothing outside their small valleys. The men from Hesse remembered autumn days when children gathered windfalls into baskets, when the best fruit was wrapped in paper and stored carefully, each apple a small treasure to be rationed through the months ahead. In Württemberg, they had pressed cider in wooden mills, the juice running golden into barrels, and the taste of it became in memory almost sacred, a flavour that no other place could replicate. One prisoner, a non-commissioned officer who had worked in his family's orchard before the war, spoke with particular intensity about the discipline required to grow proper fruit. German apples, he insisted to anyone who would listen, were crafted by nature working in harmony with careful human attention, not thrown together with careless abundance. His words carried echoes of something larger, a belief system that had been hammered into them through years of propaganda, the constant repetition that German methods, German precision, German quality in all things stood superior to the crude materialism of other nations, particularly America. This was not just about fruit. It was about maintaining a world view that justified everything, that made sense of sacrifice and suffering, that allowed them to believe, despite all evidence, that their cause had been righteous and their defeat merely temporary, a setback that would be corrected once the natural order reasserted itself. The camp censors who read their letters found this theme appearing repeatedly. One Feldwebel, writing to his wife in Würzburg, reassured her not to worry about his treatment, but felt compelled to add that American food lacked culture, lacked refinement, that even their apples could not compare to what they had at home, and that he dreamed constantly of her strudel, of sitting at their kitchen table with the afternoon light coming through the window and the smell of baking filling the room. These sentiments served multiple purposes. They were expressions of genuine longing, certainly, but they also functioned as a kind of armour, a way to preserve dignity when everything else had been stripped away. For soldiers who no longer carried weapons, who no longer gave or received orders, who existed now only as numbers in a camp registry, memory became the last fortress, the final territory they could defend. The certainty that their apples were better, that their methods were superior, that their culture held something ineffable that crude American abundance could never match, This certainty allowed them to wake up each morning and face another day of captivity without complete despair. But certainty, no matter how fiercely held, contains within it the seeds of its own destruction, and the prisoners had been raised on lies so consistent and so pervasive that they had become indistinguishable from truth. They had been told since childhood that Germany represented the pinnacle of civilization, that their agricultural traditions embodied wisdom accumulated over centuries, that the small family orchards scattered through their homeland were proof of a superior relationship with the land. Meanwhile, America was painted as a nation of factories and machines, of people without roots, of quantity without quality, of money without meaning. They believed because they had been taught to believe, and because believing made the world comprehensible, that their handful of carefully tended trees in a Bavarian village represented something more noble than anything this crude industrial giant could produce. What they did not know, what their propaganda had carefully hidden from them, was that American apple orchards did not sprawl across villages, but across entire states, that the scale of cultivation had been industrialized to a degree that would have seemed like fiction if described to them, that while they thought in terms of baskets and cellars, America thought in terms of millions of bushels and rail cars and processing plants that worked around the clock. In the barracks, in those long conversations after lights out, pride mixed with bitterness in complicated ways. Some of the men mocked the American fruit they had glimpsed during their journey, calling it bloated and flavourless, insisting that size meant nothing without proper taste. Others spoke more quietly, their voices carrying notes of longing that embarrassed them, describing specific memories so vivid they could almost taste them. The particular bite of a Boskop apple, tart enough to make your mouth water. The fragrance of an orchard in Thuringia after rain. The way frost touched the last apples of the season, concentrating their sweetness. One young soldier, barely 20, confessed in a whisper that when he thought of home he did not see buildings or streets or even faces anymore, only the old apple tree that grew behind his mother's house, its branches spreading over the garden, its fruit falling in September and covering the ground with a carpet of red and gold. These memories were precious and painful in equal measure, fragments of a world that felt increasingly distant, increasingly unreal, as though the war had not just separated them from home, but had somehow erased the home they remembered, leaving only these sharp sensory details floating in darkness. Their pride prepared them poorly for what was coming. The more insistent they were on the superiority of German quality, the more devastating the revelation would be when they finally confronted the scale of American production. For now, their laughter and their boasts served as protection, a way to maintain some sense of who they were in a situation designed to strip identity down to its bare components. But shields can shatter, and soon that shield would crack open, and the apples they had dismissed with such contempt would become instruments of a lesson they would never forget, a demonstration of abundance so vast it would make their careful German pride seem like a child's fantasy, a sweet fiction told by people who had never understood the real dimensions of the world they lived in. The trucks that carried them out to the work details rumbled along country roads that cut through landscape unlike anything in Europe. The prisoners sat in the back, watching farmland roll past, and most of them thought little about their destination. They had been assigned to agricultural labour, which many considered beneath their dignity as soldiers, the kind of work suitable for peasants, but insulting to men who had worn uniforms and carried weapons, who had thought of themselves as part of something grand and historic. They muttered among themselves about the degradation of it, about how they were being used like animals, and the guards who rode with them paid no attention to the complaints, having heard similar grumbling from other groups in previous days. As the convoy turned off the main road and began following a narrower path that wound through rolling hills, the talk in the trucks gradually faded. Men pressed closer to the slats, trying to see what lay ahead, and what they saw did not fit into any category their experience had prepared them for. The orchard appeared first as a distant pattern, a regularity to the landscape that suggested human intention, and as they drew closer, the pattern resolved into individual trees, then into endless rows of trees, perfectly aligned, their branches heavy with fruit that caught the afternoon light and glowed like lanterns. Red apples, green apples, apples in shades between, hanging so thick the branches bent under their weight, and the rows continued and continued, rolling over gentle slopes, disappearing into distant hollows, stretching toward the horizon in every direction until it became impossible to see where the orchard ended and something else began. For men raised in regions where an orchard meant perhaps 20 trees, maybe 50 if a family was prosperous, this vista had the quality of hallucination. This was not farming as they understood it. This was something else entirely, a transformation of the landscape into a single purpose, the systematic organization of nature into an engine of production. The trucks slowed and stopped, and in the silence after the engines cut off, someone spoke. His voice shook slightly, betraying emotion he could not quite control. "This is not a garden," he said in German, the words emerging slowly, as though he were discovering their meaning as he spoke them. "This is a land made of apples." Other voices picked up the phrase, repeating it, passing it along the line, and the words took on the quality of an incantation, as though naming the vision might make it possible to comprehend. The whole scene had a strange cinematic clarity, light filtering through thousands of leaves, the orchard alive with colour and movement, birds wheeling overhead, shadows shifting as branches swayed in a breeze too slight to feel. The smell of ripeness hung heavy in the air, sweet and slightly fermented, and everywhere the trees sagged under more fruit than entire villages back home might produce in a good year. Later, when records were compiled and statistics examined, the prisoner's impression would be confirmed by numbers that seemed almost impossible. In that single year, Washington State and New York State together shipped more than 30 million bushels of apples to markets across the country and overseas. That figure alone dwarfed everything Germany could produce even in peacetime, let alone now when bombing campaigns had destroyed infrastructure and labour shortages left fields untended. The prisoners stood near their trucks and stared, and what they felt was complex, layered, not easily reduced to simple categories. There was shock, certainly, at the scale of what they were seeing. There was also a kind of vertigo, the sensation of the ground shifting beneath familiar assumptions. They had been told America was crude, that it knew only mass production without artistry, that quantity came at the expense of quality. But this orchard did not look crude. It looked like something dreamed by someone who understood both agriculture and power, who could envision fruit extending past every reasonable limit and then make that vision real. Some of the prisoners glanced at the American guards, expecting to see satisfaction or smugness, some acknowledgement that this display was intentional, designed to humble and impress. Instead, they saw only indifference. The soldiers looked bored, perhaps slightly annoyed at having to stand around in the heat. To them, this was normal, unremarkable, not worth comment or wonder. That indifference struck deeper than any boast could have. If Americans did not even marvel at this, if abundance on this scale was so common it provoked only yawns, what else lay hidden in the reserves of this country? If apples grew here with the casualness of weeds, what hope had Germany, starved and battered, of winning a war against such plenty? The silence in the ranks deepened, men retreating into private thoughts, and the orchard became more than a collection of trees. It transformed into something symbolic, an accusation without words, a promise that the world they thought they knew had already ended, and they were only now beginning to understand what had replaced it. When they were finally led from the trucks and walked into the orchard itself, the prisoners expected to encounter the careful efficiency they associated with wartime agriculture. Every piece of fruit gathered, every resource maximized, nothing wasted because waste meant weakness, meant failure, meant people going hungry. That was how it worked in Germany, where shortages had turned even spoiled fruit into precious commodities, where women fought over potato peelings and children knew the exact number of days until the next ration distribution. But the first steps among the American trees revealed something that made several of the prisoners stop in confusion, uncertain whether they were seeing correctly. The ground between the rows was littered with apples. Perfect red fruit lay scattered in the grass, some bruised from falling, others still pristine, all of them simply lying there uncollected. Birds pecked at them leisurely. Wasps crawled over split skins. Farm workers walked past without glancing down, stepping over perfectly good apples as though they were stones or fallen leaves, things of no consequence whatsoever. One sergeant, a man from Hamburg who had survived the bombing raids of 1943 and knew what real hunger looked like, bent down and picked up an apple that showed only minor damage. He turned it over in his hands, examining it from multiple angles, and when he spoke his voice carried genuine disbelief. "At home," he said quietly, "this would be worth more than money. People would fight over this. Here they leave it to rot in the dirt." The contrast could not have been sharper or more painful. In Berlin, mothers stood in queues for hours just to buy a few potatoes, and those potatoes were often half rotten, more eyes than flesh. But people paid whatever was asked because the alternative was watching children grow thin and listless. In Cologne and Munich and Dresden, families subsisted on turnips and bread so coarse it was more sawdust than grain, and they were grateful for it because gratitude was better than despair. In the prisoner camps scattered across occupied Europe, German guards doled out rations calculated down to the calorie, thin soup and black bread, barely enough to keep men alive, and the prisoners fought among themselves over scraps because fighting meant you still cared whether you survived. And here, in this American orchard, fruit enough to feed towns lay abandoned on the ground, rotting slowly under the indifferent sky. The German prisoners walked among this waste, and their reactions ranged from outrage to something approaching awe. Some called it obscene, a moral failing, proof that Americans had no culture, no respect for what nature provided, no understanding of value beyond immediate profit. Others said nothing, just stared at the carpet of fallen apples and tried to process what it meant. Beneath all the surface reactions ran a deeper current, harder to name, a growing recognition that abundance itself could function as a weapon. The ability to waste what Germany treasured, to let food rot because gathering it cost more in labour than the fruit was worth, this revealed a form of strength that had nothing to do with soldiers or tanks. It was the quiet assurance of a war economy so robust it could feed its population and its military and its prisoners and still have surplus beyond counting, surplus it could afford to ignore. A farmer working nearby, an older man who had been hiring POW labour for weeks, offered an explanation when one of the German officers asked about the waste. He said it without pride or shame, his tone completely matter-of-fact, like someone describing weather patterns or crop rotation. The price of labour made it more expensive to gather every apple than to let the lowest grades fall and focus on the premium fruit. Market economics, supply and demand, efficiency calculations that meant nothing to men who came from a world where efficiency meant using everything because there was never enough of anything. The remark landed like a physical blow among the listeners. In their homeland, women risked death under air raids to scavenge for food in bombed-out buildings, crawling through rubble to find a can of vegetables or a bag of flour. Here, fruit was abandoned because the nation had better uses for its time and labour, had so much to do and so many resources that picking up every apple simply was not worth the effort. That evening, back in the barracks after the workday ended, the orchard stayed with them. Conversations circled around it, unable to leave it alone, picking at it like a wound. One prisoner, a corporal from Cologne, wrote in a diary that would be discovered decades later by historians cataloguing artifacts from the camps. His entry for that day was stark and painful. "I saw more apples rotting in the grass today than my family has eaten in a year," he wrote. "I wanted to weep, but instead I laughed because what else could I do? What else is left when the world you understood has been revealed as fiction?" The words captured something essential about their situation, the way laughter and despair had merged into something indistinguishable, a defense mechanism against truths too large to process. The orchard floor had become more than dirt and grass. It had transformed into a mirror, and what it reflected back was the full scale of their defeat, measured not in battlefield losses, but in the casual disposal of food that would have been worshipped if it had appeared in a German city. Every discarded apple glowed in memory like a small accusation, a silent statement about what victory actually looked like, about the distance between what they had believed and what was true. The next morning brought them back to the orchard, and they lined up at dawn expecting another day of stooping and filling crates while their bodies ached and their minds wandered to homes they might never see again. But instead of being marched immediately to the trees, they were kept waiting while an American guard, a young man whose uniform looked dusty and lived in, walked forward carrying a large basket in one hand. He spoke in halting German, words pronounced carefully as though he had practiced them, and what he said sounded at first like a joke that had lost something in translation. "Eat as much as you want," he told them, and he gestured toward the baskets of fresh-picked fruit lined up along the road. The prisoners looked at each other uncertainly, waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the catch to reveal itself. Food was rationed everywhere in their experience. Nothing was free, nothing was unlimited. To be told they could eat without restriction seemed impossible, a trick or a test, or perhaps a form of mockery. One lieutenant laughed sharply, a sound without humour. "They want to fatten us like livestock," he said to the man beside him, and several prisoners nodded as though this explanation made more sense than simple generosity. But then the guard reached into the basket, selected a bright red apple, polished it casually against his sleeve, and bit into it with a loud crunch that echoed in the morning quiet. He chewed, swallowed, and tossed another apple toward the nearest prisoner, an underhanded throw that sent the fruit tumbling through the air. The German caught it clumsily, held it in both hands as though it might explode or transform into something else, and hesitated, looking at the apple and then at the guard and then back at the apple. Finally, hunger and curiosity overcame whatever remained of pride, and he bit down. The sound was impossibly crisp, juice running down his chin, and his eyes widened with something like shock because the taste was real, fresh and sweet, not imagined or exaggerated, but genuinely good. The spell broke. Suddenly everyone lunged for the baskets, hands reaching and grabbing, men biting into apples with an urgency that bordered on frenzy. The orchard filled with the sound of teeth cutting through flesh, dozens of prisoners eating at once, and it created a strange chorus, almost musical in its way, the rhythm of consumption punctuated by gasps and muttered exclamations. Men who had sneered at American fruit 24 hours earlier now devoured it as though it might disappear if they paused for breath. Some ate 3 apples in quick succession, cores tossed carelessly aside. Others ate 5, 6, 7, their stomachs distending painfully but unable to stop. A corporal from Bremen stuffed fruit into every pocket of his uniform, hiding apples as though the gift might be rescinded at any moment, hoarding against future scarcity, even as abundance surrounded him on all sides. The diary entries and letters from this period, collected and preserved in archives, reveal the emotional complexity of that morning. One man wrote that he ate until he could not breathe properly, counted out 10 or maybe 12 apples consumed in rapid succession, and felt both shame and joy so intertwined he could not separate them. Shame that he had mocked this fruit, that his pride had been so misplaced, that his hunger had reduced him to this animal feeding. Joy that he was full for the first time in months, that his stomach was stretched and aching, not from emptiness but from plenty, that something as simple as eating without limit could feel like a revelation. Another prisoner described how arguments broke out among the men, some accusing their comrades of greed and selfishness, others muttering prayers over the fruit they held, giving thanks to God or fate or whatever force had brought them to this moment. Yet within this frenzy of consumption, a deeper understanding was spreading silently through the ranks. The guards watched without comment, leaning against trucks or sitting on fence posts, and their faces showed neither pleasure nor satisfaction at the prisoners' behaviour. To them this was nothing special, nothing worth remarking on. They had not offered the apples as calculated kindness or as propaganda tool. They had done it because abundance made it possible, because there was fruit beyond counting, and sharing some with prisoners cost nothing and solved the practical problem of what to do with men whose work would be more efficient if they were well fed. That indifference, that casual assumption that fruit could be given away freely because there would always be more fruit, carried perhaps the most crushing revelation of all. For the prisoners, each bite was a small surrender, each swallow a confession that what they had ridiculed now sustained them, that what they had called weakness revealed itself as a form of strength they had never imagined. One officer stood apart from the feeding frenzy, eating slowly, methodically, and his face showed none of the desperate joy animating his men. He chewed and swallowed and thought, and what he thought was dark. Later he would write about this moment, describing how he understood with absolute clarity that the war was lost, had perhaps been lost from the beginning, because Germany could never match this. All their talk of discipline and culture and quality meant nothing against a nation that could feed its enemies without thought, that could waste more than they could produce. Pride, he realized, had been a shield made of paper, and the first real test had torn it to pieces. He finished his apple slowly, tasted it properly, acknowledged silently that it was good, and felt something break inside himself, something that had held him together through battles and retreats and capture, but could not survive the simple experience of being fed without limit by the people he had been taught to despise. By the end of that first harvest week, the transformation was complete. The laughter and sneers had died completely, replaced by silence or by quiet conversations about things other than apples. What had begun as mockery, the casual dismissal of pig food, had turned into something more complicated, a mixture of gratitude and resentment and awe that none of the prisoners knew how to process. They no longer joked about the fruit. They ate it when offered, worked among the endless trees, and in whatever private moments they could find, stared at the orchards with expressions that ranged from wonder to dread. The younger soldiers seemed more adaptable, accepting the new reality with the flexibility of youth. The officers struggled more visibly, their faces showing the strain of beliefs collapsing under weight of evidence that could not be denied or explained away. One evening, after the day's work ended and they had been returned to camp, a group of officers gathered in a corner of the barracks, away from the younger enlisted men. They spoke in low voices, careful not to let the guards hear too much, but the guards heard enough to file reports about the conversation. Captain Heinrich Bauer, who had been decorated for bravery in North Africa, who had commanded men under Rommel and been proud of that service, spoke words that would have been unthinkable months earlier. "We believed our strength was in discipline and tradition," he said quietly, staring at his hands. "But discipline does not feed a nation. Look at what we have seen. They throw away more than we can grow. What does that make our pride worth?" No one answered him because no one had an answer. They sat in silence, each man alone with thoughts too bitter to share fully. The prisoners had been raised from childhood on carefully constructed lies, told repeatedly until the lies became indistinguishable from truth. They had learned that culture and technology and quality flowed from Europe, particularly from Germany, while America produced only crude machines and material goods without soul. They had been taught that their small family orchards, tended by hand across generations, represented a relationship with the land that industrial nations could never achieve. They had absorbed the message that German superiority was fact, not opinion, proven by history and blood and destiny. And now they stood in an American orchard so vast they could not see its boundaries, surrounded by fruit rotting on the ground, because gathering it all was not worth the effort, and every assumption they had carried dissolved like sugar in water. Statistics sharpened the revelation for those who learned them later, though the numbers alone could never capture the emotional weight of the experience. In 1944, American farmers produced more than 60 billion pounds of fruit across the country, with apples dominating the total tonnage. That same year, the average German civilian subsisted on fewer than 1,500 calories per day, rations so strict that malnutrition was widespread and children's growth was stunted. The prisoners knew these numbers instinctively, even without seeing written figures. They remembered the hollow faces of neighbours, the rationing cards that determined who ate and who went hungry, the lines of people waiting outside empty shops in cities where bombs had destroyed not just buildings, but the entire infrastructure of normal life. They remembered winters without adequate heat, without adequate food, surviving on hope and propaganda, and the bitter determination not to give up even when giving up would have been rational. And here, in this orchard, they confronted abundance so casual it seemed almost offensive. One lieutenant tried to salvage something of the old pride, muttering that German apples still tasted better, that quality mattered more than quantity, that refinement of flavour was its own form of superiority. But his words rang hollow even as he spoke them, and another prisoner, younger, angrier, shot back with venom. "Taste does not win wars," he said. "Plenty does, and plenty is what they have and we do not." An argument flared briefly, voices rising, but it died quickly when everyone realized there was nothing left to argue about. The evidence surrounded them. The fruit lay thick on every branch and scattered across every patch of ground. No amount of insisting on German quality could change the basic mathematics of abundance versus scarcity. A confiscated letter, discovered years later in an archive of camp correspondence, revealed the depth of the psychological impact. A corporal had written to a friend in words that the censors had underlined in red ink, marking it as interesting from a morale perspective. "We used to say America is rich but soulless," the letter read. "Now I think if this is what soulless looks like, then it is stronger than all our souls combined. How do you fight a nation that can afford to waste food? How do you defeat people who think rotting apples are unremarkable?" The bitterness came through clearly in every line, but beneath the bitterness was something else, a kind of exhausted recognition that the worldview he had carried his entire life had been wrong in fundamental ways, that the map he had been given bore no relationship to the actual territory, and that pride had been poor preparation for truth. That night, as lamps dimmed and men settled into bunks, many lay awake long after silence fell across the barracks. They were not thinking about battles or strategies. They were not rehearsing old victories or imagining future triumphs. They thought instead about the orchard floor, about the way light had fallen through leaves, about the smell of fermenting fruit and the sound of their own jaws working, about the way the American guards had looked bored while German prisoners ate themselves sick on fruit that would otherwise have rotted. They understood, with a dread that sat heavy in their chests, that they were prisoners not just of war's outcome, but of ideas that had failed, of a vision of the world that had collided with reality and shattered so completely that no amount of effort could piece it back together. The orchard had done what bullets and tanks could not. It had broken something inside them that would never fully heal. Eventually the war ended, though the ending came slowly for the prisoners, filtered through rumours and official announcements and the gradual recognition that the grand cause they had served was truly finished. They were processed, documented, and eventually shipped home to a Germany that looked nothing like the country they had left. But the orchard never left them, even as years passed and they tried to rebuild lives in the ruins of cities that had been beautiful once. Some could not bring themselves to speak about their captivity at all, burying the memories so deep they hoped never to find them again. Others talked carefully around the edges of what they had experienced, mentioning Illinois only in passing, describing their treatment as fair without elaborating on what fairness had meant. But when asked directly about America, when pressed by children or grandchildren or historians who came looking for testimony, their stories circled back with surprising consistency to a single image that had burned itself into memory. They spoke about apples. Old men sat at kitchen tables decades later, their hair white, their hands shaking slightly, and told grandchildren about the day they ate until they could not eat anymore. The details varied slightly from telling to telling, small embellishments or forgotten elements, but the core remained constant. They described the sweetness of the fruit, the ache in their stomachs that came from fullness rather than hunger, the bewilderment they had felt when told there were no limits. One man insisted he had eaten 10 apples that day, another claimed 12. Numbers mattered less than the principle they represented, the revelation that came with understanding how thoroughly they had misgauged the world. And then, almost always, came the quieter admission, the words spoken with downcast eyes or with gazes fixed on distances beyond the room. "That was when I knew we could never win," they would say. That was the moment I understood what we were fighting against. For these former soldiers, the orchard had become more than a place where they had worked. It stood as a symbol, a turning point, the exact location where certainty had died and something else had taken its place. In Germany, where shortages had carved permanent lines into every survivor's face, where rationing continued for years after the war ended, the idea of abundance on the scale they had witnessed in Illinois remained almost unimaginable. The orchard represented an imbalance in the world so profound it seemed to violate natural law. One nation able to waste what another called treasure. One people so secure in their plenty that giving food to enemies provoked no comment, no special notice, just another day in a harvest that would continue with or without them. The lesson stayed with them, inescapable and sharp-edged, a reminder of how completely their assumptions had been wrong. An officer writing in the 1950s, trying to make sense of his war experience in a memoir that would sell poorly and be forgotten quickly, put the matter with unusual directness. "I was not broken by artillery at Caen," he wrote. "I was not broken by tanks in the Normandy hedgerows. I was broken by apples in Illinois." That single sentence contained more truth than entire chapters of military analysis. The image had remained vivid across the years, preserved in memory with a clarity that fading photographs could not match. A retired schoolteacher, who had been 19 when captured and frightened of everything, described dreaming still about that first day in the orchard, the crunch of biting into fresh fruit, the sun flashing on endless rows of laden trees, the shame that came with realizing how small Germany's claims of superiority had actually been, how provincial and limited their vision of the world had always been. Another former prisoner, a man who rarely spoke about the war to anyone, admitted late in life that the sound of an apple falling onto grass still startled him when he heard it. The sound triggered memories he would rather not have, transported him back to that Illinois summer when everything he had believed about himself and his nation had come apart under the weight of fruit. In family circles, the stories took on different textures. A grandfather smiled while telling his grandson about eating a dozen apples and never laughing at American food again. For the child, it seemed like a strange tale, almost comical in its simplicity. For the man, it was truth distilled to essence, a fragment of history too sharp to forget or reshape. The orchard had become memory, and memory had become lesson, and the lesson was about power measured in ways that military academies never taught. The simple act of an apple rolling across grass and coming to rest in sunlight had become an enduring symbol of something larger than fruit. It spoke of a nation that could afford to feed its enemies, that possessed resources so vast that generosity cost nothing. It spoke of men who had discovered too late that warfare was not only about courage or tactics or will, but about the basic ability to sustain populations and supply armies across continents and oceans. The Führer's speeches about destiny and blood had meant nothing against the prosaic reality of surplus production. All the talk of superior culture and discipline had crumbled before the evidence of American warehouses filled beyond capacity, of orchards stretching past horizons, of a people who could look at fallen fruit and shrug because there would always be more tomorrow. In the silence after war, when survivors tried to rebuild and forget and move forward, the red apple lingered in memory not as fruit but as witness to the moment when illusions died. The prisoners who had mocked those apples on a summer day in 1944 eventually became old men telling stories to people who had never known hunger, trying to explain something that could only be understood through experience. They spoke about taste and texture and the feeling of a full stomach, But what they really described was the exact instant when the world they had been promised revealed itself as fiction, when the map proved false and the territory demanded acknowledgement. Some spoke with shame, some with awe, a few with something approaching gratitude for having survived to understand how wrong they had been. But always with a sense that they had glimpsed something essential about power and plenty, about how nations rise and fall, about why wars are won not only on battlefields, but in orchards and factories and farms. Looking back across the decades, stepping away from individual stories to see the larger pattern, what emerges is a meditation on what abundance means in times of destruction. The apple had been at first a joke, a symbol of what prisoners imagined as American vulgarity and waste. It became over the course of days and weeks a mirror that forced them to see their world differently, to acknowledge uncomfortable truths they had spent years avoiding. History records battles and speeches and treaties with meticulous detail, but sometimes the most profound lessons arrive not through grand pronouncements, but through ordinary objects that carry extraordinary weight. A piece of fruit lying in grass, rotting slowly under indifferent sky, revealed more about the actual balance of power than any general's memoirs ever could. The orchard demonstrated that strength can take forms that do not announce themselves with flags or anthems. The capacity to sustain, to feed millions without effort, to waste without fear, even to nourish enemies because doing so costs less than letting them starve. These represented power of a kind that armies alone could never achieve. For men raised in scarcity, taught to believe that discipline and sacrifice and culture mattered more than crude material abundance, the revelation came as something more shattering than battlefield defeat. They had lost not just a war, but an entire framework for understanding how the world worked, and the loss echoed through the rest of their lives in unexpected ways, surfacing in moments when apples appeared on tables or in markets, triggering memories of that Illinois summer when certainty died. Many of the former prisoners carried the orchard within them as a kind of haunting, a ghost that appeared in quiet moments and demanded recognition. They spoke of it with complicated emotions that never fully resolved, shame mixing with awe, resentment bleeding into gratitude, all of it tangled together in ways that defied simple summary. Sometimes they were thankful for having been shown the truth before pride killed them, before they wasted more years in service of lies. Sometimes they resented the Americans for making it so easy to see through the propaganda, for not having the decency to at least pretend the contest had been close. Always they sensed that they had glimpsed something about resilience that went deeper than military strength, something about the quiet engine that drove American power, the taken-for-granted plenty that allowed a nation to fight on multiple continents simultaneously while still producing surplus for civilian consumption. The decision to let prisoners eat without limit, to turn abundance into a gesture that combined dominance and mercy in equal measure, revealed a particular kind of sophisticated cruelty that the Germans had not anticipated. It would have been simpler in some ways to be starved, to be treated with the harshness they might have expected from enemies. Instead, they were fed, well fed, given more than they could comfortably eat, and that generosity functioned as its own form of defeat because it demonstrated so clearly the futility of what they had fought for. Every full stomach was a confession that the Führer had been wrong, that Germany had never been capable of competing with a nation that could afford to be generous to its prisoners while simultaneously crushing its armies in the field. Perhaps this explains why the memory lingered so persistently, why men who had seen terrible things in combat, who had watched friends die and cities burn, who had endured hardships that should have overshadowed any experience in a peaceful orchard, nevertheless returned again and again to apples when asked about their captivity. The orchard represented something beyond simple plenty. It embodied the collapse of illusions, the moment when carefully constructed pride confronted reality too large to ignore or explain away. A simple apple, red and gleaming in afternoon light, rolling across grass until it came to rest against a fence post or a stone, carried within it an entire history of assumptions proven false, of superiority claims revealed as desperate fiction, of a worldview that had seemed solid and eternal, showing itself to be as fragile as the fruit's skin. The story reminds us that history does not only live in battles and political decisions, but also in ordinary moments that reveal extraordinary truths. The prisoners who walked into that Illinois orchard expecting to mock what they found, who instead discovered plenty beyond imagining, learned something about power that transcended simple military calculation. They learned that the capacity to produce, to waste, to feed even enemies without diminishing reserves represented a kind of strength that rendered traditional measures of national greatness almost meaningless. All their culture, all their discipline, all their pride in German quality and tradition amounted to nothing against the basic fact of American abundance, and that recognition changed them in ways that battlefield defeat alone could never have accomplished. Years after the last of these prisoners died, their stories preserved in letters and diaries and oral histories collected by patient researchers, the image of the orchard remains powerful. It stands as testament to the way symbols function in memory, how a piece of fruit can carry weight far beyond its nutritional value, how the ordinary can become extraordinary when placed in the right context. The German soldiers who mocked American apples on a summer day in 1944 and then ate themselves sick on those same apples a week later experienced something that stayed with them until death. A lesson delivered not through lectures or punishments, but through the simple act of being offered more than they could consume. The lesson was about humility, about the danger of pride divorced from reality, about how nations that convince themselves of their inherent superiority set themselves up for devastation when the lies can no longer be sustained. The orchard speaks across decades to anyone willing to listen, whispering that strength takes many forms and that power often hides in the most unexpected places. It reminds us that the fragile illusions we construct to make sense of the world can shatter against truths we would rather not acknowledge, that what we dismiss as crude or worthless may prove to be exactly what sustains us when pride no longer suffices. A simple apple rolling into sunlight, gleaming red against green grass, becomes in this telling not just fruit, but a kind of prophecy, a promise that the world belongs to those who can produce beyond immediate need, who possess reserves so deep that generosity becomes possible even toward enemies. The German prisoners learned this lesson the hard way, through experience that burned itself into memory and refused to fade even as decades passed and the world moved on to new conflicts and new illusions. Their story, preserved in fragments and passed down through families, remains a meditation on what happens when certainty meets evidence, when pride encounters plenty, when the map we carry proves to bear no relationship to the territory we actually inhabit.